This video, we're going to talk about factor by grouping. So factor by grouping relies very heavily on the greatest common factor method that we had seen in the previous video. Now, before we do that, I have like a really silly example I want to do, but I find that it visually helps students kind of understand how factor by grouping works. So in this particular example, I'm looking to factor out the GCF, the thing that the two terms have in common. And just so we're clear, the two terms are this is the first term and this is the second term. And when I kind of look at it like that, well, I'm like, okay, so the thing they have in common is blob. So I'm going to factor out blob, and what I'm left with is 2x minus 3y. Okay, so using that logic, let's apply it to this next problem we see right here. What would be the blob in this problem? It's going to be this x plus y, this thing that both terms have in common. So if I factor out the blob, or the x plus y, I would be left with 2x minus 3y. And this is factored because it is a multiplication. So you might remember that the way you would actually multiply this out is FOIL. If I wanted to FOIL it, okay, that's how I would multiply that, the first, outer, inner, last. But we'll talk about that more later on when we are looking at and more examples when we're actually doing factor by grouping. Okay, so we were kind of warming up right there. Let's go ahead and talk about factor by grouping. So my first thing I want to mention is to factor by grouping, you have to have four terms. Must have at least four terms. That's important. If it doesn't have four terms, you can't factor by grouping. If it's smaller than that, like three terms, okay? Okay, so the steps for factor by grouping. So since we'll be working with four terms, in fact, I'm going to kind of allow us to see the example because as we're doing the steps, I might kind of work it out with the example here below. So what we'll do is we're going to group the first two terms together. And then the last two terms together. Group first two terms, sorry, that's an S. And last two terms. And what I mean by that is literally put parentheses. Oops, I wanted to switch to red. It's just going a little slow for me. Put parentheses around the first two terms and parentheses around the last two terms. Okay, so second step, we're going to factor the GCF out of the first group. So looking at this first group of terms, the 6x squared and the 9x, I know that the 6 and the 9 have a 3 in common. They also have an x that I could factor out. So if I factor out 3x, I would be left with x plus 3y. All right. I'm going to do the same thing, but for the second group. So that's the third step, factor the GCF, out of second group. It's a little sloppy. There we go. All right, so let's do that again. So in the second group, I could factor out 7. Oh, the sign that's here in the middle, this plus sign right here, that's going to just carry down right here. So I'm just going to write plus 7 because I'm going to factor out a 7. So whatever that sign is, I'm going to carry that down here. I'm going to erase all that green because it's a little sloppy there. And then I'm left with, let's see, 2x plus 3y. Okay, so, oh, I just realized I messed up on this first one here. I'm not left with just an x. When I factor out 3x from 6, I'm left with a 2x. Aha. And the reason I caught that is this is my blob. The 2x plus 3y is my blob. It's something that the two terms have in common. So that's the fourth step. I'm going to factor out the blob. And I'll put that in quotes because that's special for me. I use the blob as a way of indicating this kind of parenthesis term that the two things have in common. So if I factor that out, that means I have 2x plus 3y. And what I'm left with is the numbers here in front. The 3x, oops, not green, 3x plus 7. By the way, the order really doesn't matter and how I've written the parentheses. If I wanted to, I could have wrote 3x plus 7 and 2x plus y. There's nothing wrong with that. Reversing the order is not going to matter because they'll multiply out to be the exact same thing. Now, speaking of multiplying it out, and I mentioned it earlier, we could check our answer, make sure we did it correctly by foiling this and checking to see if it multiplies out to what we had started with originally. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I distribute the 2x times the 3x, that's going to be 6x squared. And then 2x times the 7 is 14x. 3y times 3x is 9xy. And 3y times 7 is 21y. And when I come back and look at what I originally had here, I'm just going to erase everything just so I could see it. That is what I had. The difference is my two middle terms are swapped. See that? Like these two terms right here are swapped in their answer here. But it's the same thing. All right, so I did it. This is going to be the answer for factoring this polynomial. Okay, let's try it again. So we're going to group the first two terms and group the second two terms, and then we're going to factor the GCFs out of the two groups. Okay, so starting with the first group, I only have x in common. So I would be left with 5y minus 8. I'm going to just bring down the minus sign there. That's between them. And then let's see, I just 2, right? I think only 2 goes into that. So that'll leave me with 5y. Okay, but because I'm factoring out a negative 2, because of that minus sign, I'm treating that like a negative. So that's going to actually become, when I do 16 divided by negative 2, that's a negative 8. Because when I multiply that negative 2 back in, that's going to give me a positive 16. Okay, so my blob is 5y minus 8. And I am left with x minus 2 in front of those terms. All right, let's try another one. So let's factor this. So from this first group, let's see, I could factor out a 3 and an x squared. And that's going to leave me with 2 and an x, and then minus 5, no x's. Okay, there we go. All right, the second group, okay, well, I don't have anything in common. 2 and 5 have nothing in common. They don't have any variables in common. So when that happens, we can always factor out 1. Oh, here, let me bring the plus sign down. So I'm going to factor out a 1, and I'm left with 2x minus 5. Okay, so there it is. Now, there's my blob. 2x minus 5 is the thing that the two terms have in common. And I'm left with the 3x squared plus 1. All right, let's try another one. Okay, so this one has a little bit more interesting things going on because, I'm realizing 4 and 21, they don't have any numbers in common. And a squared and b cubed don't have variables in common. I'm noticing the second term has stuff in common, but if I start factoring that, I'm not going to have like a matching blob. Like if I just try to factor out a 1. Okay, so in this case, when it starts to look weird like this, it might be wise to reorder the middle two terms, like literally flip-flop them. So I'm going to go ahead and write 6ab minus 21b cubed minus 14ab squared. All right, now that I'm going to try factoring. Okay. All right, so this is better because 4 and 6 have a 2 in common and an a. And then that would leave me with 2a plus 3b. Second term, okay, sorry, bring down the minus. They have a 7 in common and a b squared. All right, so that's going to leave me with, let's see, 3b, and that's going to become plus, because I'm factoring out a negative, plus 2a. Okay, so my blobs are the same. They're just written in reverse, right? I could rewrite this as 2a plus 3b, and that wouldn't be incorrect since it's an addition. Okay, so there's my blob. 2a, oop, I forgot the 2. 2a plus 3b times 2a minus 7b squared. Now, real quick, just coming back up and pretending that I just am going to try to factor it using the techniques we talked about. I just want to show you it's not going to work. All right. So if I tried factoring that first one, I could, here, let me do it in a different color. I could pull out a 1 only in the first two terms. I would have nothing else. Minus 21b cubed. You don't have to write this down. I'm just trying to show you what would happen if you tried to factor it. And then the second terms, I could factor out a 2, sorry, it's going to be plus 2, an A and a B, and I'd be left with, here, let me shift this over a little, 3 minus 7B. And clearly the blobs don't match, right? This does not match the other parenthesis term. So these two don't match. And that's why I went ahead and switched the two middle terms to begin, so that way I could make certain or make certain the blobs would match. All right, so the blobs have to match. They have to match. If they don't match, we did it wrong. All right, we need to try again. Okay, so let's try this final one. Same kind of idea as the last one. We're gonna probably have to do some switching around because I'm noticing that when I look at these first two terms, they have nothing in common. And actually the last two terms definitely have nothing in common. So I'm going to switch them. I'm just going to swap those middle two terms and we'll see what happens. That's a negative 10 minus 2x. All right. So now this first group, I could factor out a y only. And I'd be left with x plus 5. Second group, it's going to be a negative and 2, and I'd be left with 5 plus x. Okay, so just like the last one, the two terms are in the blob is just swapped. So this is really just x plus 5. I can treat them the same. And there's my blob. X plus 5 times y minus 2. And there we go.